one of the things that history shows is that, whether it is slavery proper from the colonial period to the antebellum period, or whether it's in the Jim Crow period, that actually the justification for massive inequality in American society is actually that black people are not fully deserving of the fruits of their labor. That essentially the superstructure of ideas is essentially that black people are inferior. And I want to point out a historical moment from Condemnation that I think gets us to, in part, that narrative that Michelle identified as a place that she began, but also I think operates in the ongoing debate about how much of this system is really about racism and race versus how much is really just about bad behavior, and maybe we just spend too much time locking up people and it's too much, it's too expensive, right? Because I think that's the space that a lot of policymakers are still stuck in. And we'll talk about the Dunn verdict and the way in which the prosecution addressed this issue indirectly.
But, just to underscore what you just shared, I think one of the things that's really powerful that comes through so well in your book, in your work, is that the same justifications and rationalizations have been trotted out over and over again, and yet we seem not to recognize them as biased and unjust in the current era, even though we can look back at slavery and say, oh, it was insane back then for us to have rationalized the existence of slavery, with the arguments that black men in particular are bestial and prone to violence and have to be made to work. And of course, they're also contradictory, lazy. They're both bestial and lazy and prone to violence and won't do anything. But, those were the justifications for slavery. They were the exact same justifications were trotted out for Jim Crow. And when you think about the justifications that are made for mass incarceration, it's shifted from an inherent biological justification to a more cultural one. But it is the same sort of notion that is trotted out to justify the mass incarceration of, poor inner city young men, but we look and we say, oh, it was crazy for us to think that and justify slavery on those grounds. It was crazy for us to justify Jim Crow on these grounds. But whoa, now actually there's something to the argument.
Right.
And we're willing to take it seriously today in a way that I hope, 100 years from now, we will look back and say, how could we have possibly bought into the notion that there was something inherent in black culture that justified us, coming for such an extraordinary percentage of the African American community during that time.
Well, that is the unnamed justification, even in spaces where people are liberal, or as we used to say back in the day, friends of the Negro. They're is. And we're going to move into that present space. I want to show an illustration of a couple of ideas that Du Bois. So Du Bois is the first Harvard PhD social scientist. He's actually the first national spokesperson for what we'll call an Alexandrian point of view, right? So he both starts in many ways in the same place that Michelle identified, and his own evolution with this crime issue puts him in a space that looks eerily similar to where the new Jim Crow is. So let's see this. And I just want to emphasize this because to me this demonstrates that the universe of language that we have, that we wrestle with in terms of how we understand racism in the criminal justice system, is as old as the wiring in this room.
Right.
It is really 100 years old. We are not as sophisticated as we think we are. We are not as evolved. We are using the same language to wrestle with what does it mean to have so many black people in the criminal justice system. How did this happen? So here's Du Bois at the beginning of his career, before he publishes his most significant sociological work, the Philadelphia Negro, published in 1899, which was a modern classic of urban sociology. So Du Bois is saying, unless we conquer our present vices, they will conquer us. We are diseased, we're developing criminal tendencies, and an alarmingly large percentage of our men and women are sexually impure. Translation, part of Du Bois's early entry point is to the sheer reality of what today passes as black-on-black crime. And the notion today that people who are structural critics of the system are ignoring the truth about the terrible things that black people do to each other, and that is really the source of the problem, whereas mass incarceration is actually a symptom of that problem, right? The cause is the behavior, is a symptom, puts us literally 100 years ago with the foremost thinker of this problem conceding this point from the very beginning. This is not hiding dirty laundry. This is making a career from the very beginning saying black people have too much crime in their community. Yet, that doesn't tell us what to do about it. The simple conceit that black people actually commit crimes in their communities is not, by definition, an explanation for chain gangs, black codes, convict leasing, mass incarceration, prison farms. So Du Bois, recognizing that there was limits to the actual racialization of black people as criminals, moves over time. Here's a second point. He begins to see a double standard. So after the Philadelphia Negro, you have a decade later, he identifies, called this the Philip Seymour moment. A moment where the recognition of any kind of self-destructive behavior doesn't lend itself to a national crisis of a community, but in fact is an individual problem, except when the person happens to be black or brown. So I'll just read, I was going to say the second part of the quote. Murder may swagger, theft may rule, and prostitution flourish, and the nation gives but spasmodic, intermittent, and lukewarm attention, but let the murderer be black, or the thief brown, or the violator of womanhood have but a drop of Negro blood, and the righteousness of indignation sweeps the world. Nor would this fact make the indignation less justifiable, did not we all know that it was blackness that was condemned and not crime. In other words, this notion that white people, as David Levering Lewis says in response to Condemnation, whites commit crimes, but black men are criminals, that blacks are criminals. So Du Bois is essentially articulating 100 years ago that there's a double standard in the criminal justice system. And it's precisely that double standard that allows for the possibility of two different roads to be taken on the question of what do you do to punish people, right? Because the commonsensical basis of what your claims are, the colorblindness, is that these are bad people. We have to do something. Finally, this final quote from 1932. So Du Bois, this is two quotes strung together from the Crisis magazine. So this again is illustrative of the evolution of a set of arguments that seem to position the debate over a 3-decade period in identical terms as one that we continue to have. It is to the disgrace of the American Negro, and particularly his religious and philanthropic organizations, that they continually and systematically neglect Negroes who have been arrested or who are accused of crime or who have been convicted and incarcerated. Every Negro knows that a frightful proportion of Negroes accused of crime are absolutely innocent. Nothing in the world is easier in the United States than to accuse a black man of crime. In some ways, Du Bois really closes the book on this not too long after this. He has a little bit to say in Black Reconstruction about convict leasing. He's telling a history of the South. But I ask you, Michelle, this critique of a kind of civil rights community a la 1930s America around the question of criminality seems eerily familiar to where you say the starting point for you as a civil rights attorney, really questioning whether this mass incarceration problem is really a race problem or something else.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think also when you look throughout history, there has always been deep reluctance on the part of black elites, blacks who are relatively well off, educated black folks, to stand with or show any form of solidarity to those who are viewed as criminals. And that has been true throughout history since the days of abolition, when abolitionists were trying to hold up free blacks as examples of, the intelligence and morality of people who were being held in, captivity in the South, and to say, look, these are intelligent, moral, ethical beings. We can't treat them like animals and keep them in captivity. And then during the Jim Crow era, you had civil rights advocates looking for people who were, once again, sort of the model plaintiffs, the people who epitomized moral virtue, and who in many ways looked as though they were capable of living according to white standards and expectations of respectability, and really shunned anyone who was viewed as criminal or having a complicated personal or family history. And, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund actually made very clear that except in capital cases where someone was on trial for their life, and the NAACP has long opposed the death penalty, except in capital cases where the issue was whether someone should be put to death for the crime, that they did not want to be in the business of representing people accused of crimes, even though they knew that in the South, the chances of a black woman or a black man getting anything like a fair trial were next to none, that it would harm the movement to associate or have the movement be associated with people who are understood to be criminals. And
was that, I think for the obvious question is, does that help us explain how we got in the mess that we're in today? So
I think so.
If
absolutely.
Du Bois is complaining here, does that actually make possible the disappearance of those people who are not worthy of full citizenship?
Absolutely. I think it helps to explain why the civil rights community managed to be quiet for so long, as literally millions of people found themselves swept in, locked up, and then stripped of the very rights that we'd supposedly been fighting for in the civil rights movement. This silence, because there was a lot of fear of airing our dirty laundry, allowing the public to pay any attention whatsoever to the bad people in our community. We were ashamed. And that shame, I think, led to silence and denial and a great deal of complicity and really a blind spot. So it made it possible for someone like me, who was committed to social justice, went to law school thinking about being a civil rights lawyer and advocate, to come out of law school really as the war on drugs was beginning to reach its peak.
Right.
And to think, oh, well, no, this is really just a problem of broken homes, bad schools, and poverty. This isn't a problem of the drug war itself. It's really a problem of poverty and people not yet having seized the opportunities that have been provided. And my role as a civil rights lawyer is to try to open more doors and more pathways, not recognizing that as I slept, and so many others, that this vast new system of racial and social control had emerged, and that the reason so many families were broken, the reason so many young people were giving up on school, the reason that so many of our social institutions and family networks and all that were falling apart in these communities was because a literal war had been declared on these communities. Right. That it wasn't simply a reflection of poverty and bad schools, broken homes, but in many respects, all of the, things that we trotted out, all the justifications we trotted out for rationalizing high rates of incarceration were actually, it was the high rates of incarceration were causing these very things. And so I think that we have had a blind spot in part because for a long time the strategy worked, or seemed to. It seemed to be working to, embrace Rosa Parks. It seemed to be working to lift up.
Right, because there were plenty of things to work on, right?
Yes.
Now to the point that incarceration, so this is a big claim that Michelle is articulating, that incarceration actually is a criminogenic factor, So it becomes less a symptom, not a symptom of the behavior that underlies the justification for it, but in fact contributes to destroying lives, destroying the social fabric, ripping it apart. So I want to show an image back to how we've been down this road before. So this is an image from the Philadelphia Tribune, which was a weekly black newspaper. This image comes as a cartoon editorial in 1929. So first we have an evocation of the Philadelphia Negro. This is Philadelphia, and so the incarcerated black man wears the label Philadelphia Negro, remarking on Du Bois' past. There's the obvious calling into question American democracy and the land of, or the birthplace of liberty in America, the city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. We've got the founding father here, good old Benjamin Franklin, wearing the label Old Man Philadelphia, looking with consternation and anxiety back on what has become of his city. But to Michelle's precise point, he's incarcerated not behind the bars of broken homes, bad parenting, achievement gap, low expectations, sagging, right? It's not the tropes of the cultural poverty thesis, which is everywhere in our society, even for people who stand in judgment of the criminal justice system in the wake of the Zimmerman verdict, or stand in judgment of in the wake of the Michael Dunn half verdict. In this case, it is a clear renunciation of those beliefs, which Du Bois had already 40 years ago articulated himself, that black people were incarcerated behind the walls of ill will, prejudice, segregated schools, and Jim Crowism. So not a surprise, of course, that again, here we are, zooming in on this image, and here we are today with this image. That's 70, 80 years between those two moments. That is partly explained by the fact of each generation has to determine for itself that racism is a little bit less important than it had been before, right? So we could beat up on the president in some ways on this because it's easy to do, but when the president says to the Morehouse grads at his commencement recently that essentially they have no excuses because those who came before them had a much harder time than they did, I think that's debatable. I think that's actually debatable. Different, to be sure, but not clear that, we hear a lot of nostalgia for baby boomers of the world of segregation, right? Because within that space, within that cauldron of abject racism, was the creation and the possibilities for community. So I think we, have to get smarter about what we actually teach young people and how we engage them on this topic.
Absolutely. And I think with President Obama, it's particularly fascinating that he has embraced so thoroughly this narrative that we in the black community are so obviously in a better place when, he himself has admitted to drug use, quite a bit of it in his youth, and if he had not been raised by white grandparents in Hawaii, if he hadn't done much of his drug use on predominantly white college campuses, universities, if he had been raised in the hood, and if the odds are really good he would have bbeen caught, he would have been arrested, and far from being president of the United States today, he might not even have the right to vote, depending on what state he was living in. And so, this notion that, well, there are no more excuses, you have to turn around and say, well, President Obama, where would you be today if you had been treated like an ordinary black kid growing up in the hood? Where would you be? And, I think that it isn't to deny that there has been extraordinary change in many areas. And, I think we run into trouble if we begin to kind of, overstate this notion that, well, everything is just as bad as it was during Jim Crow. It's different. It's different than it was in Jim Crow. But when we look deeply, we see that the rules and laws have changed, but there remains a system that keeps people locked out of mainstream society and staggering numbers, and the rationalizations and justifications for doing so remain basically unchanged from the days of slavery. And yet we're very self-congratulatory about all the progress that has been made.
Yeah. So we obviously have an audience of people who know in great depth your work, which is terrific. So I want to ask you, where hasn't your work penetrated? Who are the people who you've encountered in your journey who challenge you, and what exactly are they challenging you on? Where has the new Jim Crow not planted seeds of revolutionary sentiment and transformational change in the system?
Well, I can tell you who hasn't asked me to come speak to them. And I've heard very little from police organizations or groups or prosecutors. I've heard very little from people who are currently working within the criminal justice system. I've heard from judges, which I find really encouraging. I find that many judicial associations and have invited me to come speak, but prosecutors and police officers and people who are very much on the ground in a direct way engaged in the project of mass incarceration, I haven't heard much from at all. And I don't find this stunning or surprising. And I also don't think it necessarily means that all the police officers and prosecutors are rabidly seeking the destruction of the Black community. But I do think that it speaks volumes about how unwilling, those who are engaged in the enforcement and maintenance of the system are to, really have deep and meaningful, challenging dialogue about what their role is. So I would hope that more of that dialogue begins, but I have to say that, when I wrote this book, I didn't write it for them. I'm very explicit in the preface to the book that I really did have a particular audience in mind, people like me, people who cared about racial and social justice but did not fully get it yet, who did not fully, appreciate the magnitude of the harm caused to communities of color by mass incarceration. And I was also writing it, for people who did get it, but who are being dismissed. Much in the way that I had once dismissed them. People who were arguing that, this system was eerily familiar and that it had its roots in slavery and in Jim Crow and were being treated as crazy. To say, no, actually here, I want to provide some ammunition. I want to provide some tools and support and to help walk people through both the history and how the system actually currently functions. Who has pushed back, I think, in ways that, I find most concerning have been, I've done radio shows. And, you never know who's listening to the radio, and I've been invited to speak on conservative talk radio shows as well as more, liberal or progressive talk radio. And I remember distinctly doing a radio show that was hosted by a Black pastor, either in Mississippi or Alabama, who became just enraged by the thesis of the book and who said, what you're doing is letting our young Black men off the hook. If only they would pull up their pants and be real fathers and do right, by their families and stay in school. If only they would come to church and accept Jesus in their lives, none of this would even be happening. We've brought this whole system of mass incarceration on ourselves. We've done this to ourselves. It serves no purpose pointing fingers and blame. And, as I've traveled around and spoke to a lot of faith communities, I think that, his sentiments aren't real outliers. I think there's a lot of shame in the Black community And there are a lot of people who feel powerless to have, to really impact, the government or large, but it's easier to turn to the kid on the corner and say, what is wrong with you? Much in the same way that, little black girls can grow up, looking in the mirror and thinking that they're not beautiful and preferring a white doll to a black doll, as the studies have shown. I think there can be a lot of self-hate and shame within our own communities, really looking at that thug on the corner and feeling some contempt. It's an ugly part that we don't really want to acknowledge or embrace of our own communities. And we have to deal with that shame and that pain and the ways in which this drug war has divided our communities in ways that, slavery and Jim Crow did not. And when I look to the future, that's my biggest concern, is that, although the system of slavery and Jim Crow sort of planted the seeds of black solidarity, for collective action, that mass incarceration and the war on drugs has done the opposite.
Right.
It has really planted the seeds of distrust and
disintegration.
And absolutely disintegration. And, as you point out in your book, black elites distancing themselves from those viewed as criminal isn't anything new. That has a long history as well. In the era of mass incarceration, it's taken on, I think, greater proportions and even more worrisome significance.
So speaking of that, and we're going to invite Charzelle to join us. So if he's not already in the wings, he's here? Okay, come on out. We're going to have him join us. So just on that point, and this is really a kind of continuation of the same theme, but I want to hear Charzelle's take on it because, so in the wake of the Zimmerman verdict, and we all saw this play out, so we're not going to waste our precious time retracing all those steps. But the part of it I think is instructive of this moment, and the part of it that I worry is always right beneath the surface is when Bill O'Reilly chastises the president for yet again speaking out about the Trayvon Martin murder, where he again says, that could have been me, rather than it being my son, that could have been me many years ago. And Bill O'Reilly launches into a tirade essentially that revolves around the question of a culture of broken homes, of bad behavior, of thug life, and then Don Lemon co-signs on it. Right? So so this is not really for me about Uncle Tomism or calling aspersions on his race, right? This is about an ideological struggle that is partly a continuation of the past, but may be exacerbated in this disintegration moment, right? This moment where the war on drugs has splintered the black community in many more directions, where class divisions are more visible than ever, partly because there aren't as many segregated communities. There are still plenty, but not as many. And so when he then goes on a kind of 2-week defense of this position that essentially Trayvon, both Bill O'Reilly and Don Lemon, is responsible for his own murder because of the way he looked, because he was a strange Negro in a place where he didn't belong. I just find that that connection to Michael Dunn's argument about them being thugs, that connection to the prosecution and the Dunn verdict's unwillingness to name a implicit bias or racist stereotype as evidence of some form of premeditation, a willingness to use force to put down someone who was threatening. Of course, the argument of the loud music, he reached for a gun, blah, blah, blah. But all of that is circling around this moment, and I feel like the relationship between whether it's Riley voicing it, Don Lemon voicing it, a Mississippi pastor voicing it, all buttresses the way in which race is not articulated in our criminal justice system by those who are essentially searching for justice, so that both of those verdicts can end the way they do, because we don't hold people accountable for their racist beliefs in our criminal justice system currently. Now, Sharzelle, you don't have to respond to that. I was finishing a point, but the floor is yours to take on anything that you've heard us talk about.
Oh, no, it was just interesting the way you mentioned that, and all right, with saying Trayvon is responsible for his own death. However, when you look at similar situations, when a person is attacked due to their sexuality, or let's say their religious belief, it's called a hate crime. However, when a young black male walks around with a hoodie or whatever, it's his culture that killed him, or it's what he did. So once again, it's the tricks that are used to basically show that, no, we're gonna tell you what the value of a black man's life is in this country. And we'll do it blatantly, but yet have, let's say, the PR spin it around so that way we can make, you know, a good, how you say, dog and pony show out of it. So that's just my take on that. Yeah. There.
So are there things about this system? So Sharzelle is formerly incarcerated, and we wanted to hear the perspective of someone who's lived within this system in a way that neither Michelle and I have. Is there something about the system that we aren't talking about, that isn't captured in the usual critique of mass incarceration or the war on drugs?
Well, one of the things I think is the direct connection between the community and the prison system. Like they say, it's that umbilical cord, and it's one that does exist. When you look at the social problems that exist within the community itself, right now with the resources that are being pulled from, let's say, public education, you know, other things within the social structure in that community, there is no sense of continuation for the most part. At least when I was coming up, you know, you still had that, you know, fabric, you know, that solid fabric of community. However, as you said, due to the drug war, it's eroded. And it's to the point to where as you've had individuals the ages of 15, 14, making large sums of money in making decisions that, you know, an adult, a fully responsible adult, capable adult, was supposed to be making. Mm-hmm. So you take that into consideration, of course, with the access to, I mean, weapons that, you know, the police force didn't have. Then, of course, there's going to be a situation that is created. Now, trying to bounce back from that is what we see happening today. Some individuals choose to ignore the fact that, all right, we say prison problems, but they stem from community problems. And until we focus on, all right, how do we bring back the communities that we knew of in the 70s and 60s, then chances are, you know, we will continue to see other individuals capitalize off of what it is that is happening with our youth. So I definitely believe that it's the community issue that also has to be addressed, while at the same time holding, you know, the criminal justice system, Department of Corrections, accountable for what it is that you do with our young while they're in your custody, because there is a sense of responsibility that is there.
So Bill Stuntz, who is a former Harvard law professor, he passed a couple years ago after he wrote a book called The Collapse of the American Criminal Justice System. He was a sort of unorthodox student of the criminal justice system and couldn't exactly be pegged on either the left or the right of this issue. But one of the things that he talked about, which I find incredibly compelling, is that the problem for the African American community and black diasporic communities in general, and Latino ones for that matter, is that their local political circumstances do not serve their interests in ways that we watch playing out across America with regard to entire small rural counties where methamphetamine has touched every other household. Mm-hmm. We now are seeing evidence in Vermont and New Hampshire, the scourge of heroin taking the lives of young people return. And it seems that in these local communities where local officials are accountable to the white citizens of those communities, there is not a knee-jerk punitive response. In fact, many of us have heard and read in the paper that there are local sheriffs that say, I can't lock up the whole town. And yet it seems that in many zip codes, whether it's Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, that the attempt to lock up entire zip codes is exactly what has been going on. bringing it even closer to home, as we watched the mayor, the former mayor of this city, spend 12 years essentially defending racial profiling on a scale never before seen anywhere in the world. He and his former commissioner, Kelly, kept coming back to this point of, we have black supporters. We have high black approval ratings. In Kelly's last interview for Playboy, I didn't read the whole issue, just the interview.
I missed that
one. He says to the interviewer, he says, I can take you to Harlem right now and pull people off, black people off the street who are my fans. So my question, Charzelle, to you is, how much of the community does sense that policing is the appropriate response to the community problems that you identified that need addressing? Because Bill Stuntz would suggest that policing is part of a political apparatus that isn't serving the community's interests. Mm-hmm. But we often hear from within that community, we need more police officers.
I think what he probably did was exaggerate the numbers in regards to those who feel that, all right, what he's doing is right. I'm pretty sure it's a gross exaggeration. There is a portion of the community that feels that, I mean, and that's when you were speaking about, all right, us taking responsibility for our own actions. The young, for the most part, who are out there committing these acts, in a sense, some of them, and I'm not going to say every case, some individuals are to the point to where as incarceration may be something that is necessary to help correct a condition that is taking place with them. Not in every case, but in some cases. And, the elders of the community are more afraid of the young. So when you see these things taking place and it's like, well, I can't talk to them because if I do, then I'm putting myself at risk. So what happens is it's almost like a catch-22. You'll have individuals show up at the block association meetings, and they're asking the precinct within that area, listen, you have to do more, you have to do more. Not understanding that the precinct's response to do more is, yes, I'm going to create it to where as you may never have to see this individual again.
Right.
So, they think it's a solution to it as opposed to other alternatives. I remember reading, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And there's one need, and I see it a lot within the younger generation, self-actualization. When an individual, adults go through this. If you know that you have this ability, this potential. If you read a book, and let's say you're in school and the history teacher is willing to be honest, you know that you come from, this mighty people. However, when you look around you and all you see is despair, depression, drug use, it's like you have all of this energy, bottled up inside of you. You need to express it, but your outlets are limited. Mm-hmm. Your resources are limited. There is no way for you to be you. Okay. So you tend to gravitate towards things that are unlike you. I remember I had wrote a paper. I had took an elective course with Vassar College while at Otisville Correctional Facility. And looking at the 60s, when we had our Malcolm X's, our Martin Luther Kings, those individuals who gave black men a black man to look at and say, all right, well, that's what my community needs. That's what my family needs. That was an image that helped bring about the Black Power era. However, when blaxploitation came out and you got your Superflies, I believe that was in direct counter to the image of male blackness that was presented from our Martin, our Malcolms. You see what I mean? So you fast forward it to the 1980s when crack cocaine hits the inner cities. Hip hop music also did a makeover. NWA, first explicit album to ever be, mass marketed to whereas that's when they came
Some might
up
not
with,
know what NWA stands for. I've already admitted I read Playboy, so you might want to tell them what NWA stands for.
all right, NWA was this famous, in some ways, they're going to go down in hip-hop history because they were the first group that is termed as gangster rap. And NWA stood for Niggas with Attitudes. And you had a bunch of black males, young. That's when the Jerry curl was really cool back then. And, you know, you had the assault rifles and the F the government mindset. So a lot of young blacks gravitate, what, F the man? And yet, oh, yeah, I'm with that. You know, I can identify to that because my situation and circumstances are horrible. And he's responsible, so hey, get that guy. Right. Yeah. So, and when, it seems like when crack cocaine hit the streets, it was around the same time that the music also began to change. And this negative image of a black male rapper became predominant. So it's like, you know, in a paper I had wrote that, you know, maybe this is intentional. My professor said, well, no, the powers that be aren't that creative. But it's just something to show that, you know, the situation that, you know, we find ourselves in today is a lot deeper. You know, the elders, they went through a lot. But however, it is different what the younger generation is going through now, and that is evident.
So, Michelle, can I ask you if you remember the quote? He said that the people in charge aren't that creative. So what is it that H.R. Haldeman said, one of Nixon's key advisors, on the record?
Yeah, he said, the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this without appearing to. And that was...
So presidential advisor.
It was Nixon's presidential advisor.
So the quote is, here, you read your own quote, it's right there.
Just to put this in a little bit of context, though, you know, you're talking about a period of time when crack hit the streets and rap music began to change and all of that. And if we kind of take a step further back and say, what was the economic, political context within which that was happening? What was going on at that particular moment was, first and foremost, was the disappearance of work in inner city communities. And, you know, I highly recommend William Julius Wilson's book, When Work Disappears, which, you know, I think, you know, more than any other book that I've read, really just documents in a powerful way how work vanished from inner city communities, Chicago, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Detroit, New York. You just can list the communities where, you know, there is now what we look and see as kind of urban decay and high levels of incarceration and all of that. And these are places where hundreds of thousands of jobs just vanished practically overnight. Factories closed down, you know, moved overseas. Technological innovation, you know, rendered thousands of jobs unnecessary. And the people who were hit the hardest were black men. You know, it used to be that factories were located, you know, in urban areas to have easy access to cheap black labor. And suddenly, that labor was no longer needed. Black men were suddenly disposable, no longer needed to, you know, pick cotton in the fields or labor in factories. Suddenly, you had, you know, hundreds of thousands of black men and women, but particularly black men who were overrepresented in the industrial workforce, suddenly jobless, trapped in racially segregated communities, often without a car to get to the suburbs or anything, trapped in these racially segregated communities, jobless. And at that precise moment, there was also a backlash against the civil rights movement that was, you know, underway. You know, the Southern strategy was being employed in full force. And I quote, you know, Haldeman in the context of describing the Southern strategy, which was a deliberate strategy developed by conservatives, many of whom were former segregationists, who came to believe that it was possible to flip the South from Democrat to Republican, flip it from blue to red, by appealing to the racism and anxiety of poor and working class whites in the South through get tough rhetoric on issues of crime and welfare. And pollsters and political strategists found that, these thinly veiled promises to get tough on them, a group not so subtly defined by race, was just enormously successful in persuading poor and working class whites to defect from the Democratic New Deal coalition and join the Republican Party in droves. And so it was in the context of describing kind of this Southern strategy that H.R. Haldeman, who was one of Nixon's key advisors, and Nixon was one of the first presidents to employ this strategy with zeal. He recalls Nixon, explicitly saying that you have to face the fact the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Recognizing that now that it was no longer appropriate to say segregation forever, that you had to be able to mobilize white racial resentment and anxiety in a more indirect way and not use racial language explicitly, but at the same time, create some kind of system that will maintain white privilege, even in an era where, explicitly, racist language was no longer tolerated in the political discourse.
The same historical moment we find ourselves in, where voter suppression laws, is really about just making sure that people don't commit voter fraud. Because after all, asking for an ID at the polling place, that's not racist. Sound familiar? One of the interesting things about the deindustrialization moment, sort of the context for the economic devastation that happens in many inner cities that are almost singularly occupied by the poorest of those communities, who are disproportionately African American, Black, and Latino, is that the difference between having essentially a framework that makes possible, political framework that makes possible mass incarceration, and an earlier period of convict leasing, a world described by Douglas Blackman and Slavery by Another Name and other scholars, is the redundancy of black labor. So in that regard, mass incarceration is predicated on the disappearance of work. Because in the absence of the disappearance of work, black people are needed to fuel the economic engine of America, which they had always done, the very raison d'etre that they were in America in the first place. So that is obviously a significant difference between the period that comes in the mid to late 1960s and previous periods, precisely as work disappears. It's like, aha.
And which brings us back to what's going on with rap music. Because you're at a period of time when, and I go to great lengths to kind of emphasize in the book that the war on drugs was declared before, not after crack really made headlines and began to completely ravage inner city communities. It was a political project. It was part of the Southern strategy. But, once crack emerged, it was emerging in cities at a time when work was vanishing and disappearing. There was, skyrocketing rates of joblessness, increasing desperation. And so, it's not that much of a surprise that within that context that rap music itself would begin to change as a war was being declared on their communities and levels of desperation were rising in these communities where there was literal economic collapse. I mean, I think we talk about recession and our nation going through a recession in this period, but if you look at that period in Black communities, there was a literal depression happening in those communities that was not being acknowledged by our political leaders. Instead, the prevailing narrative was that Black people, there's something wrong with Black people and Black culture. Their families are falling apart, levels of violence are rising, there's something wrong with them, never acknowledging that, that the levels of violent crime in those communities were similar to the levels of violent crime among whites who were jobless and chronically jobless. But because joblessness was concentrated in these racially segregated communities at these staggering rates, it appeared that the problem was blackness,
Right.
not the economic depression and desperation that was occurring there. And as a nation, we could have responded with this outpouring of, support, economic stimulus packages and bailouts and, a massive investment in education so that the young people there might have some hope of transitioning from an industrial-based economy to a service-based economy. But instead of that, we dismantled schools, cut off drug prevention programs, and invested billions of dollars in a literal war on those communities. And so, I think, what you observed and, your reflections are just right on. That, the music changed. It was no longer rapper's delight.
I think self-destruction was probably like, hip-hop's attempt to bring to attention what was taking place, not only within the communities, but what they may have been, looking at in the music industry itself. Because, right after self-destruction, that's when, it became basically Malcolm X to Superfly. That's when commercialism became the overall theme for hip-hop music, One thing I'd like to point out, all right, when we look at, the lack of a response or a proper response to what was taking place when, a crack cocaine hit, it's like when you understand the prison system itself, when individuals are arrested, first, they go through central booking, that's where they're arraigned, indicted, things of that nature. Then Rikers Island, waiting for trial, the end results. And then they're sent to these up north correctional facilities. And I'm pretty sure the audience is aware that these communities didn't exist prior to that prison being built. Exactly. A lot of them were farmers and their crops weren't doing too well. So what happens is you're able to, one, put a further strain on a black family, a Latino family, any family that does not have any resources to constantly visit their loved one miles away. And then you have this person, being governed by individuals who don't see you as much of anything but a number. So you create a system to whereas, okay, you've arrested this individual because of his behavior. That's what led him to prison, committed a crime. While in your care, you are responsible for certain things. There are three things that we're always told when you're incarcerated. They're responsible for your care, custody, and control. That's your supervision, that's your parent. However, while in their care, there is very little done to actually recondition the individual. If you do not take it upon yourself to change, well, then that system will do nothing but help you become a monster. I've seen some individuals who are innocent of the crimes that they were incarcerated for become beasts as a result of being wrongly convicted and having that resentment in their hearts. And then being placed into a facility to whereas every guard at the drop of a dime will call you a nigger, will beat you if you look the wrong way. Now, I don't say this to, create this sense to whereas individuals have not done something wrong. That, all right, whatever amount of time that they have done means that they are absolved from the crimes they committed. I do not say that for that. However, if you're trying to reprogram an individual's thinking to think the right way, and this prison guard is supposed to represent the right way, however, he's acting more of a criminal than you are, then where does the correction come into place in that department?
Right. We're going to have a Q&A, so if you're interested, I think we're going to have a wireless mic on this side and a stand mic. We'll take as many questions as we can, mindful that we won't be here all night, so 15 minutes or so. I want just Michelle to sort of finish this formal part with kind of the most obvious double standard that exists around this, because I think once we move into a space where we're talking about correction and individuals, I think we have to remember that mass incarceration is a policy consequence. We chose to incarcerate more people. We chose to expand the definition of criminality. We chose to devote more resources to that, and we chose to target in ways that was racially discriminatory. Consequently, we cannot roll back mass incarceration without choosing a different set of policy choices that has nothing to do with individual behavior. But to Michelle's point in the book, it turns out that that behavior is remarkably similar outside of the Black community with markedly different results. So just tell us so that we all remember that, because I think we can easily get caught back in the moment. Well, of course, I don't want to live next door to somebody who's selling drugs. I don't want people shooting in my neighborhood. What else are we supposed to do? You know, we have to punish people. Well, it turns out we don't actually have to punish people in the ways that we choose to punish people. And maybe punishment, in fact, is not the choice. Because if we go back to an earlier period, it turns out that when we had this many white folks involved in inner city drug dealing and inner city violence, we decided that white people were too big to jail. And we created the New Deal. We created educational benefits under the GI Bill. We created pathways for economic security that not only reinforced what was already the fact, which was the fact of white privilege, but then gave it an economic base for that white privilege. So I'm really just wanting you to shout out to the statistics of enforcement around drug crimes versus, or the self-reported use of drugs versus the enforcement of it.
Yes, well, for anyone who's confused on the matter, you know.
I love the way she said it.
No, that, you know, all of the data really has been consistent for decades that people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. And I, you know, on a personal note, you know, I have to say that one of my own aha moments was when I was representing a victim of racial profiling, and he was describing himself as someone who had done a lot of wrong in his life, as he put it. And I don't remember exactly how old he was, but he couldn't have been much more than 17 or 18 years old. And, you know, he's basically saying, you know, the police shouldn't be harassing me, they shouldn't be treating me this way, but, you know, I do have a record and I have done a lot of wrong in my life, so maybe I kind of deserve this, was the undertone of his comment. And I said, well, what is all of this wrong that you have done? And he begins to list for me, well, I've been caught smoking weed, I stole from some convenience store or this or that. He starts listing these things, and I realized that the things he was listing were things I had done myself in my youth. That, you know, I smoked weed, I got high when I was young, I shoplifted, you know, when I thought I was with a group of girls and everyone was egging, oh no, you do it, you know, get egged on. I shoplifted. He came up with a list of what I would describe as the kinds of dumb things young people do, either out of rebellion or wanting to fit in, to be part of a group. There's a lot of reasons why.
Or pledging a fraternity at Yale.
Exactly. Exactly. You know, a lot of stuff, you know, that goes on when you're young and you're rebellious and you're testing limits and you may be breaking the law. And for me, a lot of my own acting out happened at a time when there was a lot of turmoil in my family. My father was unemployed. We were getting evicted from our house. I was acting out a little bit. And I thought to myself, he has this idea of himself as a bad person who's done wrong, a bad kid. And I'm looking at him thinking to myself, there is nothing that you have done so far in your life that George Bush didn't do, or any number of kids in suburban white schools or anywhere else do, and then they go to college. That's what they get to do. And, what we've done, I believe, is create a system in which young people, in certain types of communities get criminalized at a very young age for engaging in precisely the same kinds of behavior that occurs as a matter of routine in many other communities. Not only do they get criminalized, but they begin to think of themselves as bad and as wrong, and they're treated as though there's something fundamentally wrong with them. Then they're abused in the system, beaten by guards, treated as less than human, and then they're released, and they're permanently locked out. All the old forms of discrimination are legal against them, and then we say, well, you have to take some personal responsibility in this. I say, well, yeah, all of us have to take personal responsibility for choices. I have to take personal responsibility for the choices I made as a young person that weren't so great. But how do we explain our decision to create a system that punishes permanently a group defined largely by race and class for the same kinds of mistakes that other people make and go on with the rest of their lives? And that, to me, is what this caste-like system is all about.
If for questioners, if you have a specific person you want to answer, let us know. So in the interest of us moving efficiently, then let us know. Carl?
Okay, Carl Dix. There's another dimension to that Haldeman quote, that the problem is the blacks. And that is the folks that run this country looking back at the 1960s and remembering what young black people did then, and how it rocked their system, and wanting to avoid that now. And in effect, their programmatic approach of criminalization and incarceration is a counterinsurgency launched before the insurgency can begin. I call it something that amounts to a slow genocide, which could easily become a fast one. I'm not going to get into that now because time is short, but let me reference a talk that I gave. Mass incarceration plus silence equals genocide. Riverside 2012, it's up online, check it out. But here's my point and my question. This criminalization is the soil out of which Trayvon Martin's murder, Jordan Davis's murder sprang. This is urgent and it calls for people to act. I'm going to tell you, it's going to take revolution, nothing less, to end this kind of stuff once and for all. And I'm going to tell you that everybody with an ounce of justice in their hearts needs to be a part of responding. That's why I was a part of calling for a day of outrage and remembrance for Trayvon, Jordan Davis, and all the other victims on February 26th. My question, is this kind of activist response a necessary ingredient to transforming the situation that I believe you all have aptly described in the time that y'all had up there? And I can throw that to all of y'all, but y'all can figure among yourselves.
Do you want to go first? Or you want me to? Huh?
I would love to.
Go ahead.
Because that's something that a lot of us would speak about while inside. However, responsibly, revolutionary, it may not be the best approach due to the fact that, we already see what's being done if we look like we want to do something. So, if we get back up there and act like we want to do something, then I think the response would be, you drop a wallet, you'll get shot at 41 times. So, yeah, I strongly believe that what has to be done is more diplomatic, more, I would have to say, community-based. We have to be able to, pool our resources as a community and as a people and invest with individuals who have solutions to the problems that affect our areas, that affect us, and go after them. Not so much sit there and spend a lot of time just talking about it, but actually experimenting. Well, hey, listen, I know a guy over here, he does good workshops that they'll have individuals thinking along different lines when it comes to, dealing with a young group of individuals who happen to be in junior high school and they're exposed to these certain dangers, let's say cyberbullying and stuff like that, to help give them, some self-esteem. All right, let's go bring them in, call them in. As opposed to, okay, well, we're going to put that on shelf for next week. Let's talk about what's going on over here. Start implementing some of these ideas as opposed to just constantly talking about it.
I think there's a lot to be said for more action and actually getting to work as opposed to just talking about how bad things are. Mm-hmm. But I want to kind of pick up on, your question about is it going to take revolution? And I think for me, what's really important is for us to get really serious about what do we mean by that. When we say revolution, what are we saying? What do we really mean by that? I, for one, someone who doesn't believe that we can just reform this system and get it right. I feel that the system of mass incarceration itself is so fundamentally corrupt and does so much harm, some would say evil, that it's not a matter of reforming the system of mass incarceration to make it a better, more just system. It's about reimagining entirely how we relate to poor communities and communities of color, what justice looks like, what it means. And for me, that is talking about a radical change, a truly revolutionary change where we're not responding to poor communities of color in a punitive fashion, but in a caring and compassionate one, where those communities themselves are coming together to find solutions and fashion solutions, but we're also insisting upon dignity and fair treatment and the recognition of our basic humanity. And so for me, that is revolutionary change. But the question is, how do we go about it? And, I think that one of the things that one of the points that you make quite well is that, the government, through COINTELPRO, as well as through, our system of mass incarceration itself, has struck some fear in us. And it is one of the reasons why we've become demobilized. And so, you think to yourself, well, if the police are going to shoot me whether I've done something or not, I better not give them a real excuse to come after me. We live in a world of constant surveillance now. You think it was easy to infiltrate the Panthers or, the civil rights movement back then. Well, now, they're reading your email, the video cameras are everywhere. It can be daunting, very daunting to think about how could we possibly organize a movement that would result in truly transformational change. And yet, I think that's precisely the question we have to be asking ourselves. And so, for me, it's not a question of, is it radical change or revolutionary change or, reform? It's, no, we actually have to aim for something that will, at the end of the day, feel revolutionary, that we have completely transformed how we treat, respond to poor communities and communities of color generally. And the question is, how do we do that? And I don't think it's about us all taking up arms. I think we'll lose that way. Mm-hmm. And, for me, I am someone who believes much more in a nonviolent approach to change, because I think, really, I believe, the master's tools do not dismantle the master's house. Let's not go that way. I'm not going that way. I would like to have a system and a society that's based on care, compassion, and concern, a recognition of the dignity and humanity of each and every one of us, no matter who we are, where we came from, or what we've done as human beings. We are entitled to basic dignity and human rights. And that is a radical change from where we are now. Mm-hmm. And, in the Declaration of Independence, where white men got together and said all men, are created equal with certain inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and left out women, forgot about the slaves. That was a revolutionary idea. And it remains a revolutionary, ever-expanding, changing idea to the idea that all of us, men, women, black, yellow, red, brown, have certain inalienable rights, and that we are ought to be afforded basic dignity and respect. It's a radical, revolutionary idea even today. And the question is, how do we actually make it manifest? And, that's a conversation all unto itself.
I'll add two things quickly. One, social movements have always benefited from a hard left. And so, Carl, you keep on doing what you're doing. It makes it easier for the rest of us. And second, I know, you're gonna get me fired out of here. The second thing is that, coming back to the issue of local politics, we cannot go to the ballot box every 2 years and accept the status quo. I mean, we can't accept this trading on public safety as the organizing principle of the kinds of communities we want to live in, where nobody can run on a platform of, I'm going to care about the criminals in the community, because my goal is to transform the definition of those human beings who we label criminals as actually citizens of this community, and I'm going to work to transform their lives. Like, that's radical, right? And that doesn't have to be anything but having courageous political leadership and the willingness of voters to vote for those people. We should have prosecutors who are held accountable for not prosecuting abusive police officers. And we shouldn't have to twist people's arms to say that you have unethical, minimally, and outright criminal people on your force who go out day after day dehumanizing people and create a pathway from law enforcement to a prison cell. That's my 2 cents.
I want to deal with the answer and the solution. When you gave us the good helping the father of sociology, W.E.B. Du Bois, that's the answer. The Philadelphia Negro, well, really the American Negro, needs to be analyzed, interpreted, and assessed. Because W. Du Bois, and he gave us the Philadelphia Negro in 1896, he made it possible for European Union to say, America is jail. The only difference is I'm in maximum security and you're in minimum security. It also gave the backbone to Josephine Baker that said the very idea of America make me shake and tremble. So what we need to do is look at the Philadelphia Negro and say that he dealt with the impurity of the democratic apartheid system. The democratic apartheid, tyranny of the majority and tyranny of the minority. And then the other side of that is that we got to stop this whole love affair with democratic politics, what Malcolm said. Malcolm said the Democratic Party is a wolf and the Republican is a fox. Both of them are from the dog family and both of them would kill you. So how you prefer death? So we're going to have to stop. Our academic folks going to have to stop. They're going to have to step off that educated food plantation and get real and design a system where humans can be proud and wonderful and loving and all of that. So my suggestion is that Du Bois got the answer. We need to study that thing. It haven't been studied like it should. I mean, that's that's the best book he ever did.
Condemnation takes it up.
Yes,
A Blackness. Thank you, Avocados.
And also the final point is that like the impurity, and we're dealing with impurity of the democratic system. It's like being honest. We just got to be honest and move that agenda.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This is fantastic. So my question is, this is open to everybody. When you have highly public or people with relatively large platforms like Melissa Harris Perry or Ta-Nehisi Coates, who, when they address the problems of institutional racism and mass incarceration, are dismissed as inciting race issues or dismissed as race baiters. And on the other hand, you have people like Don Lemon and Bill Cosby, who quite misguidingly believe that if you pull up your pants or stop saying nigga, that things like employers are more likely to hire a white felon than a black person with no record, or studies that identical resumes or with a quote unquote black name are less likely to be selected. How do you, aside from Ms. Alexander's wonderful book, combat And Mr. Khalil, you touched on this with when you said we have to be smarter about teaching. How do you combat those who have mainstream platforms who seem to affirm like already widespread beliefs in most of America that the problem is an us problem that we need to fix ourselves? How do you go about proportionally to what they have attacking those views?
I'll give a quick take on this. So, I've had the good fortune or the curse of being around some tables in the last 2.5 years that have been incredibly eye-opening in terms of what counts as expertise, who has the authority to define a problem, to chart the course of solution. So I spend a lot of time separately when I'm not with Michelle Alexander and Charzelle, talking about how statistics function as a kind of colorblind, race-neutral language. So we can all talk about the high rates of criminality among African Americans as a way of simplifying extremely complex historical and contemporary problems. And that's really a hard sell to people because it seems most people can't have a conversation about what the problems are without citing more and more statistics. And they really do come out of a specific space and time meant to reinforce white supremacist readings of the black condition and to silence or foreclose counter narratives, right? So it takes a lot of words to explain to folks who are throwing their system statistics back at you, that you have a problem and say, but wait, we have to, and then, you've got all these long quotes, and it takes an hour and 15 minutes to get to it, and by the time you're done, people are looking at you like, ain't nobody got time for that. But the truth is, that's the only way. Because you can't beat a numbers game. You cannot beat the numbers game. Racial disparity data is useful, but it has limits because it is always subject to a counter-interpretation. You say 1 in 3 black men are in prison. I say 1 in 3 black men are criminals, right? 1 in 3 black men doesn't by definition mean the criminal justice system is racist. So you can line up whether zero tolerance policies in our schools, the disproportionate rates, but the counter narrative, or at least the dominant narrative, I'm actually reversing the term, the dominant narrative is that black kids behave badly in school. And so because you can't win that game, I'll give you one final example about this. We can never have disproportionate white representation when white people are roughly 70% of the nation. It's nearly impossible, right? Because we're talking about essentially taking, the better example is a more theoretical one, but it makes the point. If we were in an all-white nation, you could never have disproportionate incarceration of white people. Get it? So the closer we move to a small population, as in black people who are 12% or Latinos or Hispanics who are 15%, the much greater the likelihood of statistical disproportionality, which ultimately is the strongest and most enduring weapon that those who are perpetuating mass incarceration use against us. So the answer to your question is that every person who sits at the table, no matter how big or small, whether it's the dinner table with your children, whether it is the conference table in your school, whether it is a technical assistance table, I've got my friends from the Vera Institute of Justice here, or whether it is a policy setting or legislative table, you've got to make the case. You have to make the case, and more of us have to be willing to put our professional status on the line in order to move that ball forward. Meanwhile, Paul will take care of the revolutionaries outside.
Thank you all for being here. As a New York City public school teacher, high school teacher, and the junior scholars instructor here at the Schomburg, I wanted to ask, what is it that teachers and parents can do to advocate for change in the realm of the school-to-prison pipeline? So in New York City public schools, oftentimes when students misbehave or are suspended, they're more likely to get superintendent suspensions now. And what it looks like is kids get arrested, they get taken out of school in handcuffs, and then they have to appear at a site in order to get sentenced to an off-site. But this is not jail, but this is the process when you get a suspension, which is pretty much this normalizing what it's going to be like when it's time for you to get arrested for real. They've already been in cuffs in 9th grade, 8th grade. So what a lot of parents don't understand their ability to advocate for their children or what ways they can actually advocate for change. And a lot of teachers are uncomfortable with risking their jobs. So what can we do to combat this in a way that's actually constructive and where school administrators will be more receptive?
That's an excellent question. And, you know, I think it is absolutely one of the most important challenges we face is dealing with the push out of young people from schools onto the streets, which of course is a pipeline right into prison. And my view is that we have got to invest a lot more time and energy in teaching people how to organize. You know, during the civil rights movement, you had a lot of work being done teaching people how to organize, to confront, challenge, deal with white racism and the Jim Crow system in the South. So how do you know, people are going down to teach people how you organize, you know, for voting rights. How do you organize voting registration drives? How are you going to organize sit-ins? How are you going to organize to challenge educational inequity in certain schools? There was a lot of energy and investment that was placed in teaching people how to organize in order to achieve change in their communities. Today, unfortunately, in my experience, there's a lot of money invested in experts, you know, in think tanks and policy groups and large civil rights organizations where their advocacy is primarily in courtrooms and legislatures and all of that. But ordinary people are not being supported in their ability to organize for change, so that when their child is being pushed out, that they don't have a community structure to be able to turn to that can actually go to the school, advocate for that individual, and also advocate for policy change. So I would really love to see far more attention and energy, resources, foundation funding devoted to helping to train parents, you know, family members, community members, how to organize for change in their schools and their community as a whole. Because it's not going to just happen in some trickle-down fashion where there's policy change, you know, above and then it all trickles down to schools. It's actually going to have to be a bottom-up effort, in my view, where parents take responsibility for the education of the kids, and there is a collective effort in communities to say, no, you're not throwing away my child. No, you are not taking any more of our children. You're not going to treat him like a criminal simply because he was being unruly in class. You know, in other communities, you know, in more privileged communities, when a kid is acting up, there's often an effort to, oh, where's the school psychologist? How are we going to get some intervention to find what's going on with this young person? How can we help them? Why are they acting out? What's going on with them? But in poor communities of color, you get, you know, taught early on, you're going to jail one day, and let me just teach you what handcuffs feel like now in front of your peers, and you're taken out in a classroom. And that can change, but we're going to have to learn how to organize in our communities and, you know, really engage in that grassroots organizing and movement building that I think is going to, you know, force change from the bottom up.
Mention one thing. I think a lot more energy also needs to be invested in, like, becoming innovative with our approach. True, parents need to get much more involved in what is going on with their children. However, they're faced with a challenge because of work, you know, and I mean, as a child, I never understood what it was that my parents were going through. I wanted them to be there at the track meet. I wanted them to show up for this, that event, and didn't understand what it meant being a parent, the responsibilities and how tiring a day can be. So it's being able to create situations to whereas, all right, a parent and a child is able to occupy a space at one time. Maybe workshops. Or if you have, I notice schools always have these group of students that are just always doing well. They tend to be the A students, the honor roll. Being able to get them to become, let's say, politically involved in that process or become organizers. So now what you do is you help a child develop a skill that is marketable once they reach a certain age. So I would say maybe we need to get our children more involved in our community development efforts, as opposed to looking for, let's say, this expert over here who's going to want this and that third in money or salary. When we look at the civil rights movement, those were college students. Why not tap back into the colleges for some of those think tanks or workshops? Because that'll be working towards their paper and their grade, so you really don't have to worry about paying them. So.
All right, so we are 5 minutes away, or 10 minutes away from 8:30. We're going to wrap up at 8:30 so that everyone who is being polite and not getting up and disturbing their neighbors can get up, which means we have to do rapid fire questions. And so I'm going to take two at a time. Do I have a question over here, which is why someone's raising his hand? Okay, so hold tight. So the next two questions, I'm sorry we've reached that moment where no comment, so it's going to be a comment or a question, but not both. So I'll politely let you know if you're prefacing the question with a little comment. Now I'm talking too long. Go ahead.
Hi, good evening. After Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Aiyana Jones, et cetera, I'm tired, I'm exhausted. I'm at the point that I don't want to raise my children here, honestly speaking. How do I feel not discouraged to feel that way? And with the new idea that Cuomo put in, not a new idea, but he's trying to bring back free college education to the prisons upstate. Why not do it for the gentlemen and women who are in prison? Why not do it for the at-risk youth here who are not in prison to prevent them to come into that prison pipeline? That's all.
Good question. Yes. That's one question. That's a very good question. We'll get to it.
Ms. Alexander, your book focused a lot on the Supreme Court and the ways in which they were not upholding the Constitution. My questions to you are, how do we utilize, it's so important that we utilize our votes to vote for people who are going to put in not the Scalias, Alitos, and Thomases. How do we make sure that? How do we hold people accountable when they're running their platform and just selling us hope? And and also, can you see, while we're doing that, a vision of actually having a justice document where we can all sit at the table and actually create something that's for all people?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of that?
So the last part is, do you see us working with the voting of people who are going to uphold the Constitution, also working with creating a new document where we all sit at the table, not just like white dudes, but all people sitting at the table
to create a new constitution?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right. You want to jump in on that? I have the first question. Hold on. We'll take those two. So the question was about despair in these trying times, and the panelists are free to respond. How do you maintain your commitment and hope for a better day? And then the question about the focus on education for incarcerated people versus those who are not yet incarcerated.
All right. So you go place first.
Okay. I share the feeling of despair at many times, and I think that we have to just remind ourselves that we can't allow ourselves to be defeated by the despair. I think we should allow ourselves to feel it, but we can't allow ourselves to be defeated by it any more than, for me, any of my ancestors were defeated by it. I think that we have to be honest for what it is and sit with the feeling of it and not deny it and stuff it down and just go about our business. Flip the channel. All right, I can't deal with that. But actually really deal with the grief around it. Allow ourselves to experience and acknowledge it, and then find a way to make that way out of no way and say, I'm even more committed than ever to ensuring that we bring this madness to an end. And that's not easy, and I don't think it happens overnight. But, I often think about it in terms of, I owe my ancestors, I owe the people who came before me, to not get too tired, to not get defeated, to find a way to just keep it on and holding on to that hope. And, but hope alone isn't going to get us very far. if we, aren't also willing to really get to work. Now, what does it mean to get to work given our current political situation? And the question about judges and how do we ensure that, there are judges who are actually going to do justice on the Supreme Court as opposed to eviscerate Fourth Amendment rights and unravel, the guarantee of equal protection under the laws and all of that. I think it's an enormous challenge. And, I have to say that my own views on all of this have evolved over the years. There was a time when I really thought that if we just worked within the system to elect the right people, well then, we would have the right people on the Supreme Court and justice would be done. And I don't see it in that way anymore. Yes, we need to do what we can to elect good people in office, but we also have to develop a commitment, in my view, to changing the nature of our political process itself. We right now have a two-party system, both parties, funded by the same corporations and the 1% interests, and we cannot pretend that we are ever going to achieve anything like transformational change if this is allowed to continue. This current political system, the way it's designed, is not going to take us to the promised land. It's just not. And so again, I think it's about, are we really willing to ask the hard question and sit with it and say, what is it going to take to achieve really transformational change, revolutionary change, radical change? And if the answer is that this current political system as it's devised isn't going to take us there, then what are we willing to do to change it? And I speak for myself as a civil rights lawyer and advocate, it's very easy to dodge that question. It's very easy to run from battle to battle, from press conference to press conference to courtroom, trying to slay the dragon. And never step back and say, are we ever really going to win this way? And it doesn't mean that we don't hold the press conference when Trayvon Martin is shot dead. It doesn't mean that we stop going to court to fight for individual rights and to keep people from being just chewed up by the system. It doesn't mean that we stop doing what we can within the system, but we have got, I firmly believe, to step back and ask the bigger, deeper, harder question of how do we change the nature of this system itself? And if we're not even willing to ask that question in a serious way, really wrestle with it, then we cannot be surprised 50 years from now when we're having the same version of this kind of conversation and still, kind of tilting at windmills. So I hope that we'll get serious about building a human rights movement in this country, a truly transformational movement. And I think there are people in this room who are already committed to doing that and whose, work is truly inspirational to me. But as a progressive community, I don't think we're there yet. And until we get there, I think we're going to see a lot more of the same.
I think we covered most of those questions. Frankly, I don't.
Well, I just want to mention one about the education in prison, when so much resources is being pulled from education in the communities. Individuals have to lean on their local politicians. Whoever got in Cuomo's ear to have him focus on education in the prison system, well, we need to get somebody in his ear about education in the local communities. Because education in the prison system is a good thing. When a person who has that much time on his hands, I mean, you see Malcolm X, When you have that much time on your hand to do nothing but educate yourself, it puts that person in a position to redefine themselves. I don't know what can be more beautiful than, like, to use that expression, the analogy, a rose in a concrete.
Right.
But when a man is able, a man or woman who has been through the hardships in life, is able to educate themselves and then be able to critically analyze what it is that they've been through and then come up with some of the solutions, have serious dialogue about the solutions now. Because I'm not just coming from a textbook point of view. No, I've been there and I've done that. So I can give you the detailed accounts what is going on at this point in time in a person's existence and what could be done to, help correct that. So that way that individual does not have to be sitting in the same position I was at that point in time in my life. So no, that is a beautiful thing for education to be put back into the prison system. What we have to do is be able to utilize these individuals who have gotten their educations in prison to get on these coalitions, these teams, these task force, to sit there and speak with these local politicians and say, well, hold up, no, we can stop the mass incarceration by educating, better education. Because in the book, When Work Disappears, the reason why a lot of those individuals were left jobless is because their educations to begin with were nothing. So when you understand that education is the key to combat mass incarceration, then you're able to get more individuals involved with, yes, the public school system and its structure needs to be changed just as much as the prison system. Because it's ran. Just one more point I'd like to, I had read one time, the lady, I believe her name was Black. By profession, she's business management. However, they had her running a school system. Her background was not education. So it shows you the mismanagement that is taking place.
Absolutely.
Welcome to the new, Race to the Top ethos of America, starting with No Child Left Behind. I wanted to say something about Malcolm X. So Schomburg is home to the Malcolm X papers. And I don't know how many of you heard the news recently that a child in one of the public schools, I believe in Brooklyn, Queens, was told she, I believe, could not write a paper about Malcolm X because he was a bad man. And interestingly, so I've participated in a couple of Inside Out programs, which is about students coming from a college to a prison and being a joint class. Well, what a sad commentary on the nature of our system when prison officials actively discourage incarcerated people from reading Black history. So Malcolm X, the autobiography, is banned in California in certain facilities, precisely because it's seen as a recipe for disorder. So when we say, what are we going to do? Like, everybody who's in charge of that policy, out of here. Like, if I could figure out the steps to leave here to go to be in that person to then fire those people, I would do it. And yet there are people that are already there. And why do we allow at every step along the way people to dehumanize other people in the name of justice? I walked through Rikers Island 10 years ago on a tour when I was at Vera. I'm going to get Vera in trouble. And the correction officer showed us certain cells, and this was meant to, essentially be just an opportunity to check out Rikers. We walk in one cell, and besides it being these small, decrepit, rundown places, the sink wasn't working. So I said, "Hey, man, why isn't the sink working? This isn't Hotel Rikers." But that little bit, and this was a brother, right? 25-year-old corrections officer. This isn't Hotel Rikers. So we're okay with that, right? We walk out of there on that tour and we say to ourselves, hey, they should be dehumanized in the name of justice. All right. Last two questions, and then I don't know what we do, but last two questions.
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying to Michelle Alexander, thank you very much for coming and for writing this book. It was an education for me, as well as Dr. Muhammad in reading your book, The Condemnation. They both brought me to an interesting place. One from a historian, the other one from a legal scholar, and it brought me back to a book written in 1972 by Samuel Yeti called The Choice. He was the first Black reporter at Newsweek, and he was at Newsweek at the time that Nixon was in the White House with H.R. Haldeman, his right-hand man. Okay. And Samuel Yeti, the choice was about the obsolete Black man in America. And there were three choices. One was integration, assimilation, and extermination. This is what they had in place in 1972. And both of your books brought me to this place. So my question is, well, actually, you helped me understand this, Ms. Alexander, by the internal and external prison that takes place. I realized that instead of out-and-out extermination, they found another way to get rid of us, in a sense. And by taking away the voting, the voter suppression, this is another way in which they changed the language and used a way to exterminate us, and in trying to make us disappear. So I just wanted to say, in closing, what are your thoughts on that particular book, and if you guys had read it, and if you had the same, come to the same place, the conclusion that I came to. Thank you.
I haven't read it, but I want to now.
I haven't either, but I mean, just in the interest of time, I think we share the same, essentially the diagnosis and the, the concern that, this isn't, we're not here because it was an accident. I mean, I think if you walk away from here still thinking somehow this was an accident and there's no blood on anybody's hands, then I think you missed the point, and you're living with a set of beliefs, right? And beliefs are incredibly powerful, that defy the reality of the people who have been victimized by it.
And I have to say, I think a big piece of it is really us collectively owning what we have done. We treat all of this as just, bad policy choices. Maybe we've locked up too many people. Maybe we should reduce mandatory minimum sentences. Maybe we need to tinker here and there, without really owning up to what has been done. I'm a believer we should have reparations for the war on drugs. We've never got reparations for slavery, never got reparations for Jim Crow. Now they're saying, let's legalize marijuana and let's do all this. And I say, okay, well, I support legalizing marijuana. I don't think anyone should be saddled with a criminal record for the rest of their life because it caught with some weed. I support legalizing marijuana, but we're not going to just legalize marijuana and go on about our business without acknowledging what has been done, why it has been done, and actually have some form of reparation for the harm that has been caused. That's how healing takes place. That's how we actually go about building a beloved community that acts as though it cares about one another, is when harm is done, to acknowledge it, claim it, admit it, and do our best, as imperfectly as may be, to repair that harm. But instead, we are, obsessed with dealing with everything in race-neutral language, saying, our mass incarceration costs too much. Let's not talk about race, let's talk about costs. Let's talk about downsizing, let's talk about modifying, let's talk about legalization. Whatever we do, let's not talk about race and who has paid the ultimate price. And let's not actually invest in those communities and do what we can to repair the harm. And today the current language for reparations is called justice reinvestment. The Justice Department supports the language of, justice reinvestment. It's based on this notion that, the money that has been spent locking up people should be reinvested in the communities that have been harmed most. I support justice reinvestment. Of course, we should take the money that's being saved, kind of warehousing people, and invest that money in the communities that have been most harmed. But we can't do it by kind of neutering the language in a way where we're denying what has really gone on. I think we have to be willing to say, we're paying reparations to this community. We're admitting that we have committed a gross racial injustice, and we are going to do our best to repair the harm. If we don't, if we just legalize marijuana and say, we're going to transfer some funds here and there and move on, I guarantee that the exact same attitudes that Khalil has documented so well in the Condemnation of Blackness and that helped to birth mass incarceration are going to resurface again, because we as a nation have still not learned how to actually genuinely care about people who seem different, of different colors, and we have not admitted to ourselves that those ideas of blackness are fundamentally wrong. And if we aren't willing to admit it out loud, we're just going to keep doing this over and over and over again.
And then you get the last word.
Okay, so I might be a bit wrong on this, and well, this is entirely a learning experience for me. But based off my own interpretation of what this entire speech and presentation has been about, is that there seems to be this one problem since the beginning, sort of on just everyone in general, about correlation does not mean causation, and that, so based off what I'm seeing, that after slaves have been freed, but without any money or resources at all, and that they had to settle into poverty, essentially, because of the situation they've just been released from. They sort of, like, people have, like, loosely associated and correlated African Americans with poverty and crime, even though that's not true at all today. But people still, like, artificially associate the two with this. So I think that we need to sort of, like, emphasize like saying that we shouldn't, like, draw conclusions or stereotypes, and we shouldn't like having exactly, like, correlation does not mean causation. So what do you think about that?
I'll let you take that.
Well, I'll say that I think the comment that you just made is a wonderful summation of some of the major themes that we addressed, that correlation is not causation, and that you are at the beginning of a journey of owning this history and making something meaningful as a result of it. So, last.
And all the niggas that been throwing bricks at the penitentiary since I'm a child from Harlem. My question is this: I had to steal to read your book. I've been going to Barnes and Nobles and read 80 pages every day because I didn't have the money. I was changing, so I read the book every day. What I want to say is this: there's a lot of y'all here that's very intelligent, that got all kinds of connections to all kinds of things. We're not gonna rock y'all. Come to the blocks and talk to us.
Amen.
Dialogue where we don't have to go revolutionize. Use our intelligence. Our intelligence. And we show love to each other. Not pointing fingers saying, well, this happened, that happened. We know what happened in 1482 when they told Columbus, Michelangelo to paint the Last Supper. They came here and made everybody think that these one people were superiors. Well, I don't want to get into all that. What I want is help. Help to help us to be a better human.
Yes.
We'll be back here 600 years from now, which if I'm not, you can help me because y'all professors in here. And every generation is 30 years, right? So that's 20 generations away from slavery. So instead of us keep pointing fingers and having dialogues and talk, let's have some action.
Amen.
So we got our marching orders. I'm going to give our guests the final word.
Well, I just want to say thank you for allowing me the opportunity to give back.
Thank you.
And I echo that. I appreciate the opportunity to be in dialogue with you, and I hope that we will all take it upon ourselves to challenge ourselves, to think more deeply about how we can build a movement that is truly transformational and how we can take action now, often, perhaps following the leadership and inspiration of people who have been formerly incarcerated and who know best how this system works and feels in their own lives and their own communities. So thank you.
To Chardell, to Michelle Alexander, to all of you, thank you so much for being here.